Isaac Brown entered the world in silence, not because his birth was unimportant, but because the land he was born into had no intention of listening. Texas in those years was still shaping itself, stretching outward with raw ambition, driven by iron tools, wooden beams, and the belief that progress justified everything it consumed. It was a place of rivers that needed crossing, of land that demanded connection, and of men who believed the future belonged to them alone. Isaac was born enslaved into this expanding frontier, his body claimed before he could speak, his life assigned a purpose that had nothing to do with his mind. Yet even in bondage, even in the narrow confines of a life dictated by others, something within him refused to remain small. From an early age, Isaac noticed things others overlooked. Where most saw a river, he saw tension and weight. Where others saw wood and iron, he saw balance, angles, and force. He did not have books to guide him, no formal schooling, no permission to learn. What he had was observation. He watched wagons strain under loads, watched beams crack and ropes snap, watched bridges fail and be rebuilt stronger. He listened to conversations not meant for him, absorbed fragments of instruction meant for white engineers and overseers, and quietly assembled knowledge piece by piece. His mind became a workshop long before his hands were allowed near the tools. Texas was growing fast, and growth demanded structure. Roads needed bridges, rivers needed spanning, and settlements needed to be tied together if the land was to become profitable. Enslaved labor made this possible, but among the hundreds of men forced into backbreaking work, Isaac stood apart. He was not simply strong, he was precise. He understood why one design failed and another held. He could sense imbalance before collapse. When beams were laid incorrectly, he noticed. When supports were too weak, he knew. At first, his observations stayed inside him, unspoken and unacknowledged, because knowledge in a slave was dangerous. Intelligence threatened the illusion that bondage was natural. Eventually, his mind could no longer remain invisible. An overseer noticed that structures Isaac worked on failed less often. Someone noticed that when Isaac adjusted placements, corrected angles, or reinforced joints, the work held. His hands began to be guided not just by command, but by expectation. He was asked to look, to measure with his eyes, to solve problems others could not. But this recognition came with no dignity. It was not respect, it was exploitation. Isaac's mind became a resource to be extracted, just like his labor. There is a particular cruelty in recognizing brilliance while denying humanity. Isaac was never called an engineer, he was never credited as a designer, he was never paid for his intellect. Instead, his knowledge was filtered through white authority. An overseer would present Isaac's solution as his own. A plantation owner would take credit for a structure that stood because Isaac understood how weight traveled through wood and stone. His brilliance became invisible the moment it proved useful. Isaac lived in a contradiction that defined his existence. He was essential to progress, yet excluded from it. He helped shape the land, yet had no claim to it. He solved problems that benefited commerce, travel, and expansion, yet could not travel freely himself. Every bridge he helped build became a symbol of this contradiction. Others crossed safely because of his mind, while he remained bound on one side of freedom, watching the world move forward without him. The environment around him reinforced this injustice daily. Texas celebrated expansion, innovation, and strength, but only when those qualities appeared in white bodies. Isaac's intelligence was tolerated only because it served power. He was allowed to think, but not to be known as a thinker. Allowed to design, but not to be a designer. Allowed to build, but not to be a builder in name. His mind was leased, not acknowledged. At night, when the tools were put away and the land grew quiet, Isaac carried the weight of what he knew. Knowledge did not free him, it isolated him. He understood more than most men around him, yet had fewer rights than all of them. He knew the language of structure and load, yet could not speak openly without risk. A wrong word, a suggestion, spoken too boldly, could be interpreted as defiance. Intelligence in an enslaved man was always suspect. It challenged the very foundation of slavery. And yet, despite the danger, Isaac continued to think. He continued to observe. He continued to improve what he touched. There is something deeply human in that persistence. Even when denied credit, even when denied ownership of his own thoughts, he continued to build correctly, carefully, and with integrity. His work was not careless or vengeful. It was precise. It was responsible. It was the work of a man who understood that lives depended on the structures he helped create. The land itself became a silent witness to his existence. Rivers crossed by bridges he helped design carried wagons, families, goods, and soldiers. Towns expanded because passage was possible. Commerce flowed where obstacles once stood. And yet, Isaac's name was absent from every record that celebrated this progress. The bridges existed, but the man behind them did not, at least not on paper. This erasure was not accidental, it was intentional. To acknowledge Isaac Brown as an engineer would have meant acknowledging that intellect was not confined to race. It would have meant admitting that the system of slavery depended not on superiority, but on theft, of labor, of talent, of legacy. It was easier to bury his name than to confront that truth. Isaac's life unfolded within this quiet theft. He aged under it, his hands grew rough from work, his body wore in from labor, while his mind remained sharp, constantly calculating, constantly adjusting. He watched younger men repeat mistakes he could have prevented, because he was not always allowed to speak. He watched structures fail where his advice was ignored, and stand where it was quietly followed. He learned that survival meant restraint, patience, and silence. The tragedy of Isaac Brown is not only that he was enslaved, but that he lived in a nation actively benefiting from his genius while denying its source. America was being built not just by muscle, but by minds like his. Minds forced into darkness so others could stand in the light. His story challenges the image of progress as purely heroic. It reveals a darker truth, that much of what was celebrated was achieved through stolen brilliance. Isaac did not leave behind journals or signed blueprints. Enslaved men rarely did. What he left behind were structures, physical proof of understanding, balance, and foresight. Bridges that lasted longer than expected. Designs that held firm against floods and time. Silent monuments to a man whose mind shaped them. To speak of Isaac Brown now is to restore something that was taken. Not just his name, but his humanity. He was not an assistant. He was not merely skilled labor. He was an engineer in every sense that mattered, except the one history allowed. His life reminds us that intelligence does not require permission to exist, only the chance to be recognized. The first chapter of Isaac Brown's story is not one of triumph, but of contradiction. A brilliant mind born into bondage, a builder who could not claim what he built, a thinker whose thoughts were used but never honored. His story does not begin with bridges. It begins with a stolen future, quietly resisting erasure through the only means available to him, excellence that refused to disappear, even when his name was forced to. The bridges that rose across Texas in those years were celebrated as symbols of progress, proof that the land was being conquered and connected. They were spoken of with pride, described in newspapers and ledgers as achievements of vision and determination. Names were attached to them. Owners, contractors, overseers, companies, each one presented as a builder of the future. Yet beneath those names, beneath the ink and the praise, there was another presence, one that history chose not to see. Isaac Brown's genius lived inside those structures, locked into their beams and joints, carrying weight long after his own name had been stripped away. Bridge building in early Texas was not simple labor. It required understanding how water moved during floods, how soil shifted, how weight traveled through timber and iron. A mistake could mean collapse, death, and loss of trade. This was not work that could rely on strength alone. It demanded calculation, foresight, and adaptation to an unforgiving landscape. Isaac understood these demands instinctively. He learned by watching failures, by studying the way wood bent before breaking, by observing how supports behaved under strain. Over time, his understanding went beyond observation and became design, even if no one allowed him to call it that. When a bridge failed, the cost was immediate and visible. Wagons were lost, lives were endangered, commerce halted. Plantation owners and town leaders could not afford repeated failure. That necessity forced them to rely on minds like Isaac's, even as they refused to acknowledge what they were doing. His role expanded quietly. He was consulted without being credited, listened to without being named. Suggestions attributed to others came from him. Corrections made in the field reflected his judgment. His presence became essential, but always unofficial. There is a particular bitterness in watching others receive praise for work shaped by your mind. Isaac would have seen overseers stand before completed structures, explaining design choices they did not fully understand, accepting congratulations for decisions they did not originate. He would have watched men pose beside bridges as symbols of their success, knowing that without his insight, those structures might never have stood. Yet he could say nothing. To claim authorship would have been dangerous. To insist on recognition would have been seen as insolence. Silence was the price of survival. The bridges themselves became witnesses to this theft. Every plank laid at the correct angle, every support placed where fork. He demanded it, carried Isaac's thinking. His calculations were not written on paper, but embedded in the structure itself. When floods came and the bridge held, it was his foresight at work. When heavy wagons crossed safely, it was his understanding of load and balance that protected them. The land benefited from his intelligence daily, even as it denied him the right to benefit at all. The injustice went beyond personal pride. Credit was power. Being recognized as an engineer meant access to opportunity, wages, and legacy. By denying Isaac credit, the system ensured that his genius could never translate into freedom. Even after emancipation, the absence of records would follow him. Without documentation, his experience could not be proven. His expertise, though real, could be dismissed. The erasure was not only immediate, it was designed to be permanent. White engineers and supervisors learned from him, even if they never admitted it. They absorbed his methods, repeated his solutions, and carried that knowledge forward into careers built on what they had taken. Isaac's influence spread invisibly, shaping practices and designs that would be taught to others. His mind helped educate a system that refused to educate him. The irony is sharp and painful. A man denied formal training became a teacher to those who would later claim expertise. The bridges altered the landscape in visible ways. Towns expanded because crossings existed. Trade routes formed where obstacles had once stood. Communities grew safer and more prosperous. Each successful structure reinforced the myth that progress belonged solely to those in power. No one questioned where the knowledge came from, because questioning would have exposed uncomfortable truths. It was easier to accept the illusion that innovation flowed from the top down, rather than from the enslaved minds forced to labor below. Isaac's relationship to these bridges was deeply complicated. They were evidence of his brilliance, yet also monuments to his erasure. He could point to them only in silence. He could know what he had done, but not claim it. The bridges stood strong, while his identity remained fragile, constantly threatened by a system that viewed him as replaceable. Each completed project was both a triumph of skill and a reminder of injustice. There is also a deeper emotional cost to this kind of theft. To have one's mind used without acknowledgement is to be fragmented. Isaac was allowed to think, but not to exist publicly as a thinker. His intellect was separated from his identity. Over time, this separation could become a kind of internal exile, a sense that the most valuable part of oneself belonged to others. The bridges bore his genius, but they did not bear his name, and that absence echoed through his life. Even among other enslaved workers, Isaac's position was isolating. His role set him apart, yet offered no protection. He carried responsibility without authority, expectation without respect. If a structure failed, blame could fall on him without defense. If it succeeded, praise went elsewhere. This imbalance created a constant tension, a quiet burden that he carried alone. The nation that crossed those bridges told itself a story of progress and ingenuity. It celebrated expansion while ignoring the moral cost. Isaac's life exposes the hollowness of that story. Progress was not clean or fair. It was built through exploitation, through the deliberate suppression of talent based on race. The bridges that connected communities also connected injustice to prosperity, binding them together in ways history often refuses to acknowledge. Isaac may never have seen himself reflected in the nation he helped build. He created paths for others while remaining trapped himself. His genius strengthened a country that denied his humanity. That contradiction lies at the heart of his story. The bridges were not just physical structures, they were symbols of a system that could not exist without his mind, yet could not tolerate his recognition. To remember Isaac Brown now is to challenge the narrative that credit naturally follows contribution. His life proves that recognition is often withheld deliberately, not earned automatically. His story forces us to ask how many other names were buried beneath the structures we still use, how many minds shaped the world without being allowed to belong to it. The bridges still stand in memory, even if some have long since decayed. What remains is the truth embedded in them, that America's progress was carried not only by celebrated figures, but by men like Isaac Brown, whose genius bore the weight while history looked away. The final injustice of Isaac Brown's life was not confined to bondage or stolen labor, but to what came afterward, the deliberate burial of his legacy beneath paperwork that refused to name him, and a history that chose convenience over truth. When the bridges were finished and the land moved on, Isaac's presence faded from the record as if he had never existed. His work remained visible, used daily by people who never knew his name, while the man himself was reduced to silence. This was not an accident of time. It was the natural conclusion of a system designed to consume talent without acknowledging its source. The blueprints that guided construction bore signatures that were not his. Contracts listed owners, companies, and supervisors, but never the enslaved mind that solved the problems no one else could. Even when Isaac's ideas were essential, when his understanding of weight, flow, and balance prevented disaster, those contributions were absorbed into the authority of white names. Paper became a weapon as powerful as chains. By controlling what was written, the system controlled what would be remembered, and by leaving Isaac out, it ensured that his brilliance would die with him. This erasure had lasting consequences. Legacy is not just about recognition, it is about continuity. A wrecker. Dead name allows knowledge to be traced, studied, and honored. Without that record, Isaac's contributions could not inspire future generations, could not be cited as evidence of Black intellectual achievement, could not challenge the myths that justified inequality. His absence from history reinforced the lie that innovation belonged only to one race, one class, one version of America. Even freedom, when it came, could not fully undo this theft. Emancipation did not return stolen credit. It did not rewrite documents or restore years of unacknowledged work. Isaac emerged into a world that still refused to see him as an engineer, because proof had been erased. Experience without documentation became invisible. He may have carried knowledge that could build cities, but without recognition, that knowledge had no market, no protection, no permanence. Freedom arrived late and incomplete, offering survival but not restoration. The nation continued to cross bridges shaped by his mind, unaware of the debt it owed. Progress marched forward, telling itself stories of ingenuity and courage that excluded the enslaved. Textbooks praised expansion while ignoring the stolen intelligence that made it possible. Isaac's legacy was buried not by time alone, but by choice, a choice repeated generation after generation. What makes this burial especially haunting is its ordinariness. There was no single moment when Isaac's name was struck from the record. It simply was never written in. Silence became routine. Omission became tradition. And over time, absence hardened into truth. The bridges became anonymous achievements, their origins simplified until complexity disappeared. History smoothed its rough edges by erasing the people who complicated the narrative. Yet buried does not mean gone. The structures themselves stand as quiet testimony. They hold the logic of Isaac's thinking in their angles and supports. They endure floods, weight, and time because he understood how to make them endure. In this way, his legacy survived despite the effort to erase it. His genius became inseparable from the land, embedded so deeply that it could not be fully removed. Remembering Isaac Brown now is an act of recovery. It is an attempt to pull buried blueprints back into the light, to acknowledge that progress was built not only by those who claimed it, but by those denied the right to claim anything at all. His story forces us to reconsider what we mean by contribution and who we allow to be counted. It challenges the comfort of simplified history and demands a more honest reckoning. There is a particular sorrow in knowing that Isaac likely understood this erasure even as it was happening. He may have known that his name would not survive, that the bridges would outlive him while his identity faded. To continue building under those conditions required a profound inner resolve. It meant choosing excellence, even when excellence brought no reward. It meant leaving a mark on the world without the promise of being remembered for it. The burial of Isaac's legacy also reveals how fragile truth can be when power controls the narrative. Without deliberate effort, entire lives can vanish from memory. This is why stories like Isaac's matter. They remind us that history is not complete, that it must be questioned and re-examined. They remind us that absence is not evidence of insignificance, but often proof of suppression. In restoring Isaac Brown to the story, we do not change the past, but we change how it is understood. We acknowledge that America's foundations were laid by hands and minds it refused to honor. We recognize that bridges, roads, and cities carry not just physical weight, but moral weight, the weight of stolen lives and denied legacies. Isaac Brown was more than an enslaved laborer. He was an engineer whose mind shaped a nation that refused to credit